Hi and welcome to the History Hut. I'm Jim, this is Dr. K, and today we'll be talking about Canada during wartime. We've talked about the war itself, but we're going to talk about changes within Canada during that period. So what about change during the war in Canada?
Well, I think one of the most important things, and there are two really important things, but one of the most important things is labour, like the condition of labour in Canada. There's an increased need for workers, as we've seen, because Canada is actually supporting the wartime effort overseas. And of course, the army's removing men from the labour pool. So got to go somewhere. I wonder where you could go. Well, normally you'd probably turn to the immigrant pool, but since Canada's decided that it should probably, you know, try and shut down immigrant labour because we were in a recession before the war, immigration numbers just trickle to practically nothing. So go from about 400,000 a year in 1913 down to 145,000 in 1915, and then only 48,000 people in 1916. So it's not going to come from there. And by 1916, there's a serious shortage of workers, and we'll get to that because, of course, women are going to enter the workforce. They're going to perform all sorts of charitable functions as well, but they'll enter the workforce too. However, during the war, men who were still at home were really glad of a job after the recession, so they, you know, put aside their grievances, then there's all sorts of trouble with an increased number of strikes, and by 1917 there's more union activity and again more kind of tension within the labour force, and the West seemed, it's always the hotbed, the West seemed particularly militant, and it's after the war that the West really just goes up in flames, and you probably know what I'm talking about because I know you have friends in Winnipeg, the Winnipeg General Strike. So during the war, the problem with labour is not enough workers. Women are going to come into the workforce en masse. Well, first of all, they'll want single women, and then, you know, the Peggy Bundys of the world, the married with children, then they get to come in as well. But it's after the war, really, and although this is after the war, I think it's important to mention. So you have union memberships doubling during the wartime, and again, the West seemed more militant. We talked about this before, Fabian socialism, and the fact that most people had immigrated fairly recently and they're aware of syndicalism and the use of the general strike in France. So workers of the world, all in Western Canada now, all aware of what you can actually do. And there were great worries in Ottawa because after 1917, we had the Bolshevik Revolution. Yay, go Bolsheviks! Once you had that, then the worry was that workers would become easily radicalized. That's a genuine concern. So they talk about, of course, the Red Scare, Russians, you know, Reds under the beds, Russians everywhere. And so they were worried about trouble in the West. So you have two things happening. You've got workers that know about things like this. You have workers that are maybe more left-leaning. And you also have returning soldiers that come home to face unemployment. And there's also been quite radical inflation during the war. So it's a, you know, it's a tough blend here. So the government, in its infinite wisdom, tried, and of course it had passed the War Measures Act, so it could do this kind of thing during the war. The government tried to stop the circulation of radical literature, so you don't want them out, you know, running stuff off their little printing presses to each other, and so they banned the publication of anything that they thought was radical. And the Trades and Labour Congress, the TLC, seemed to support the government at first, and so the Western unions actually broke with the TLC. So the Western unions break away from the TLC at the 1918 convention over a motion that was defeated, and the motion was not to criticize the government. They're like, hey, the war's over. We can criticize them if we want. So out west, you actually have the formation of a new group called the OBU, the One Big Union. And this is an idea that comes from Britain much, much earlier on. But you see it in 1918 in Calgary, and it's patterned on the Wobblies, and that's the International Workers of the World, the IWW. And I remember a long time ago, I had to try and find a wobbly songbook for one of my friends and get that through customs. It was quite the challenge, but I found it in the Communist Bookshop in Glasgow, right behind the Tron Theatre. So I did bring that home. So the idea is that, remember that trade unions, the way they usually work is that you have them separated by craft. So the plumbers are all in one and the carpenters are in another, and plumbers go out on strike. Then they have to depend on perhaps a sympathy strike by somebody in the other union. So this one, it was all the workers in one union. And of course, it meant that if you didn't have a craft, you could still be in a union. So you could still be protected. And of course, if you're all in one big union, the OBU, then you can actually use the general strike as a way of shutting down services. So it's like French syndicalism. It's quite interesting. So anyway, they have 200 delegates who met in Calgary in 1918. Sounded quite radical. British leadership, the Royal Northwest Mounted Police infiltrated it because they were worried that it was subversive. But I'm sure that, as usual, with the Mountie pants with the big hips at the side, you'd probably be able to tell if they were really clean cut and 6'5" and everybody else looked like a miner. And probably like, I think he's the Mountie. I'm not sure. That big hat and that horse standing right beside him and the fact that he keeps running off to the musical ride might be an indication, but you never know. They could have been undercover, which would have been even funnier. So the Royal Northwest Mounted Police worried that the general strike will actually be used to shut down services. And of course, this is what happens in the Winnipeg General Strike, but it doesn't seem to have been as a result of OBU action at all. So it's interesting. You've got the OBU, you've got the TLC, you've got it's not the tender loving care, you've got the TLC, and then you have the workers in Winnipeg who are in a bit of a funk. And so when the Winnipeg General Strike comes, the aim is, I think, to have a 6-hour day, which seemed incredibly radical at the time. A 5-day work week. Most people, of course, remember worked 6 days, or they worked 5.5 days. And kind of things that we think of as fairly normal. So we wouldn't consider that to be like, oh, send out the army. There's people out there that want to work just a regular kind of day, just awful. So the general strike does come, it comes in 1919. It's not started by the OBU. It seems to have been spontaneous. And we do actually have film footage of it because people were using moving cameras then. And so you can actually see, moving cameras. So you can actually, not videos, none of your video stuff. No, moving camera, moving pictures and stuff. So anyway, in May of 1919, you have the workers in the buildings and metals trade striking for higher wages and for union recognition. Really, really important, the right to union recognition. And as I said before, inflation had been a real problem. And of course, there's some unemployment as well, even though all the women had been told to go back home, and most of them did. So at Winnipeg, within 2 weeks, other city workers came out in support. So you did actually have the general strike that everybody had been panicking about. So all essential services were shut down. And I think in all about 30,000 men walked off the job. So it's quite the strike. And I think the most worrying thing for the business people of Winnipeg and probably for the government was the language used by the strikers, because the strikers set up a central committee of strikers. Now, what does that remind you of? The Bolshevik Revolution and communism, the Central Committee of Soviets, So people were like, oh, no, they're all communists. And of course, the Central Committee of Strikers acted like a mini government, and it decided which vans could cross the lines and which vans couldn't. And there are sympathy strikes throughout the country. There's strikes in Edmonton and Vancouver and Hamilton. I think, in fact, there's something like 420 strikes in that year. And a number of those are sympathy strikes. So the reaction in Winnipeg from the business community was that, of course, they overreacted. They're like, communists! So they talked about the Russian Revolution taking place in Western Canada. Like, this isn't about labor. This isn't about wages. This isn't about union recognition. these are communists and they want to overthrow the government. So, I mean, it's like a genuine fear at that time. The strike lasted about 42 days. Businessmen published articles in a newspaper called the Winnipeg Citizen, and they formed their own committees and, again, you know, said this isn't a strike, this is a revolution. Some of them took to sleeping at night in churches because they were scared that they were going to be, you know, attacked in their own homes. So they really thought this was a, you know, major political thing. And everybody's kind of on edge, and the strikers started to issue recreational passes and stuff. And this is from the Western Labour News, strike edition number 12. And on the front, it's just says "Forward to Victory," and in the middle box it says what we want. The demands of the strikers are the right of collective bargaining. Secondly, a living wage. And remember, we talked about this before, I think, where that's a husband should be able to make enough to look after his family. And the reinstatement of all strikers. What we do not want: 1, revolution; 2, dictatorship; and 3, disorder. So they really, you know, they really do want better wages and so the right to collective bargaining, union recognition, all those kinds of things. And it really doesn't seem to be you know, I mean, it is radical because they haven't done it before, but not really Lenin of what? Lenin of Winnipeg, Lenin of Lake of the Woods, or something like that. So the federal response, of course, is to side with the business community, and they blamed it on immigrants. They're like, well, it's all these, it's all these legal aliens that have come in with all their crazy talk of revolution, so it's them. And the government supported employers who refused to accept collective bargaining, and instead, of course, sent in the police force. So you have the Royal Northwest Mounted Police assembling in force, and the veterans formed vigilante groups and citizens' militias. And the federal government amended the criminal code so that it could arrest and deport any aliens suspected of seditious activity against the state. So it's, you know, it's hardcore stuff. So the Central Committee of Strikers, of course, realising that things were getting a little out of hand, told their men not to go on any marches, but still on, I think, June the 20th, an angry crowd gathered at City Hall, and it decided to demonstrate on Saturday, June 21st, so that will become known later on as Bloody Saturday. And, of course, the Winnipeg Mayor Charles Gray banned all public demonstrations, and the Royal Northwest Mounted Police were ready for any action from any side, so it didn't really matter which side. So the veterans went on a silent march to the legislature, even though they had been told not to, you know, not to get involved in this. The strikers came out to watch. The Royal Northwest Mounted Police charged the crowd at Portage. And I think it's because on the actual documentary footage, you see somebody, I think, throwing something at a Mountie, and it kind of hits him in the leg, and he topples over kind of off his horse, and that's it. It's like game on. So in the end, there's 1 dead, 1 mortally wounded, and 30 people injured, and the violence seemed to have brought everybody to their senses. I know it doesn't do that in hockey games, but it seems to do that in every other walk of life. So violence brought everyone to their senses, and on July 3rd, the walkout was called off in return for a Royal Commission investigation. So, in the end, there had been, as I said, about 420 strikes that year. The Royal Commission got together and they found that, yes, there was widespread labour unrest. Oh, smart of them, yes. And of course, the problem with the Royal Commission, it's good to have a Royal Commission, but the problem is that it usually takes a long time, sometimes years, for the Royal Commission to come back, and the government's never bound by the findings of a Royal Commission. So it gives you, if you're in government, it gives you a little bit of breathing space to get things to calm down. But then if the Royal Commission says something you don't want to do, you don't actually have to do it. So, you know, it has all sorts of benefits. So the Royal Commission said, yes, widespread labour unrest, and proposed a sweeping programme of social reform, set a minimum wage, maximum working hours law, said there should be unemployment benefits, insurance, and there should be collective bargaining. But of course, you know, none of this has to stick. But it's interesting. So if you were to ask what the strike achieved, I think one of the answers could possibly be that it turns the labour movement towards politics, because this violence just didn't work. So it takes them a while, but they turn towards politics. And first in the 1930s, you get the CCF, and then that turns into the NDP later on, the New Democratic Party of the modern period. So first of all, it turns labour to politics. And you could argue that the same thing was happening in Britain, because you get in the 1890s, I think, the development of the Independent Labour Party, which then turns into the Labour Party, and then workers will elect people who are workers to represent them. So the same kind of thing going on in other parts of the world. The second thing is that it kind of left a legacy of resentment, because it's shown that the Prime Minister was ready to use force against the strikers, and that's never going to get you any votes. So people kind of suspicious of the government, and worried about a little bit about the future. But it turns them towards politics. So they're mad at the government, and in fact they will turn away in the 1920s. Labour and the farm vote will actually turn away from the Conservative, that union government, and will turn away from the Liberals as well, and look more towards like workers' candidates and Labour candidates. So quite interesting. So a lot of action on the Labour front during the war, and then this just total breakout thing after the war, the Winnipeg General Strike. There's tons of really good articles on the Winnipeg General Strike, and of course you can go to the National Film Board of Canada and watch the documentary on it that has all the actual footage from the time. So that's one of the big things. But the other things probably are even bigger.
Yeah,
even
well, thank you for the 40-hour work week. But that wraps up this part of this episode. Join us for more next time.